Hello, family. Enjoy this relaxing moment with Surly Tales. Remember to hit the like button, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. It means the world to us. Also, share this video with your friends and loved ones, and turn on post notifications so you don't miss future videos from us. Thank you as you do so. Sit back and relax as we dive into the story. Elena had spent the entire day making sure everything was perfect. The dining room was immaculate, the chandeliers casting a golden glow over the elegantly set table. The meal, lamb, roasted potatoes, and Victor's favorite wine, was prepared to perfection. Even her dress, a deep red silk that hugged her curves just right, was chosen for him. It was the dress he had once claimed was his favorite. The one that made him pull her close and whisper in her ear that she was the most beautiful woman he had ever laid eyes on. But tonight, as the clock neared 8, she stood by the door, waiting for him. And when he finally walked in, he didn't even glance at her. No smile. No acknowledgement. Nothing. Instead, he strode past her, tossed his coat over a chair, and reached into his briefcase. A thick white envelope landed on the dining table with a heavy thud. Pack your things. You're leaving tonight. The room spun. Elena's breath hitched as she stared at the envelope. What? She whispered, her fingers trembling as she reached for it. She tore it open. The moment her eyes scanned the contents, she felt as if the ground had been ripped out from under her. Divorce papers. Cold. Impersonal. Already signed. She looked up at her husband. No, not her husband. Not anymore. Victor, she said, her voice barely audible, what is this? He unbuttoned his cufflinks with casual ease, as if this was nothing more than a business transaction. It's over, Elena, he said flatly. Her heart clenched. But why? What did I do? Victor let out a slow, cruel chuckle. He poured himself a drink from the crystal decanter on the bar, and took a sip before answering. You got boring. Elena's breath caught. He set his glass down with a soft clink and met her gaze with indifference. I've moved on, he said smoothly. I've found someone better. Better. The word hit her harder than a slap. Tears burned in her eyes. Victor, we built a life together. I gave you everything. I stood by you when you had nothing. You gave me nothing, he interrupted, his voice laced with disdain. I built this. I made this empire. You were just there. Elena staggered back as if he had physically struck her. Just there? The late nights she spent organizing his schedules, the endless sacrifices she made to support his dreams, the years of standing by his side, all of it meant nothing to him? Her hands clenched into fists. You don't mean that. Victor's expression was stone cold. I do. She was still trying to process the devastation when she heard approaching footsteps. 2 large men in black suits stepped into the room. Security guards. Victor took another sip of his drink, unbothered. They'll escort you out. Her stomach dropped. Escort me? She echoed, her voice breaking. Victor barely glanced at her. You're no longer welcome in this house. Victor, please, she whispered, desperate now. Don't do this like this. At least give me time. You have 10 minutes. One of the guards stepped forward. Ma'am, you need to leave now. Elena's legs felt like lead. She turned back to Victor, hoping, praying, that this was some kind of sick joke. But his expression didn't change. There was no remorse. No hesitation. Just cold, calculated cruelty. And then she realized. He had never loved her. Not really. She had been nothing more than a placeholder, a trophy wife until he found someone better. Her hands shook as she turned toward the staircase, but the guards followed closely, making it clear she wouldn't be given the luxury of gathering her belongings. She barely had time to grab her coat before they took her by the arms and led her out the front door. The heavy doors slammed shut behind her. Then, as if the universe wanted to mock her misery, the skies opened up. Cold, merciless rain poured down, soaking her instantly. She stood on the pavement, clutching her coat around her, watching through blurred vision as the warm, glowing home she had spent years building faded into nothing but a cruel memory. She had no home. No money. No family nearby. No one to turn to. She wiped her face with shaking hands, trying to figure out what to do next. but her mind was a whirlwind of heartbreak and betrayal. Then, the low hum of an engine broke through the downpour. A sleek black car rolled up beside her, the headlights cutting through the rain like daggers. The tinted window lowered slowly. And sitting inside, studying her with a piercing, unreadable gaze, was him. Leo Romano. Victor's greatest enemy. A man she had only heard about in whispers, someone Victor loathed with every fiber of his being. She had never met him in person before, but she knew exactly who he was. Ruthless. Calculated. Powerful. And now, here he was. Elena. His voice was deep, smooth, and knowing. She stiffened. How do you know my name? A slow smirk played on his lips. I know a lot of things. Her heart pounded. This wasn't a coincidence. Before she could speak, he tilted his head and said the words that would change everything. Do you want revenge? The rain poured down in heavy sheets, soaking Elena to the bone. Her arms wrapped tightly around herself as she stared at the man inside the sleek black car. Leo Romano. Victor's greatest enemy. His name alone was enough to send men trembling, and yet here he was, looking at her with an unreadable expression. Do you want revenge? Elena's heart pounded. Revenge? She barely had time to process the betrayal she had just endured, let alone plot some grand scheme against Victor. I don't. She swallowed, her voice shaking. I don't know what I want. Leo studied her, his piercing blue eyes sharp, calculated. He was nothing like Victor. Where Victor had been polished and charming in a way that hid his cruelty, Leo exuded raw power. A quiet kind of danger. But one thing was clear, he didn't pity her. Get in, he said smoothly. Before you catch pneumonia. Elena hesitated. This man was a stranger. More than that, he was the one person Victor hated the most. Why are you here? She asked cautiously. Leo smirked. Let's just say Victor and I don't see eye to eye. And nothing would ruin his night more than knowing you're sitting in my car right now. The way he said it sent a shiver down her spine, not from fear, but from something else. Temptation. She glanced back at the house. No, Victor's house. The place she had once called home but was now just another thing he had taken from her. She had no one. No money. No future. Leo watched her, waiting. Finally, with a deep breath, she opened the car door and slid inside. The interior smelled like leather and something dark and expensive. The moment she shut the door, the rain disappeared, leaving only the low hum of the engine. Leo handed her a warm towel, which she took hesitantly. You had a long night, he said. I'll take you somewhere safe. Elena gripped the towel, rubbing the dampness from her arms. And then what? I owe you something. Leo chuckled, shifting into drive. Not yet. She stiffened. What does that mean? He glanced at her. It means I'm offering you something, but whether you take it is up to you. The car moved smoothly through the city streets, the neon lights reflecting against the rain-slicked pavement. You hate Victor, she murmured. Leo smirked. With every breath in my body. Why? His grip on the steering wheel tightened, just slightly. Let's just say he's made a lot of enemies. Elena knew better than to push. After a few minutes of silence, they pulled up in front of a luxury hotel, one of the finest in the city. Stay here tonight, Leo said, parking. I'll cover everything. Elena's pride bristled. I don't need a handout. Leo turned to her, his expression unreadable. This isn't charity, Elena. Consider it a business investment. She frowned. What kind of investment? He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a sleek, golden card, placing it on the console between them. Meet me tomorrow, he said. 10 a.m. My office. If you want to hear my offer. Elena's gaze flickered between the card and the man beside her. Something told her that whatever Leo Romano was offering, it wasn't just a lifeline. It was a doorway to something much, much bigger. And possibly something dangerous. She took the card. Without another word, she stepped out of the car and into the hotel lobby, feeling Leo's eyes on her as she walked away. As she reached the elevator, she glanced down at the card in her hand. Leo Romano. Oh, Romano Enterprises. Private office, floor 72. Her fingers tightened around the gold. Tomorrow she had a choice to make. Trust the devil Victor hated, or walk away. Elena stood outside the towering glass skyscraper, staring up at its impressive height. The gold card in her hand felt heavier than it should, like a decision she wasn't ready to make. She could walk away. She could take whatever scraps of dignity she had left and figure things out on her own. But the bitter truth was, she had nothing. No money, no job, and no home. Victor had made sure of that. And as much as she wanted to pretend she didn't crave revenge, she couldn't shake the image of Victor's smirk as he tossed her aside like garbage. Her jaw clenched. She wasn't going to be garbage. Straightening her shoulders, she stepped forward and walked into Romano Enterprises. The lobby was sleek and modern, filled with people who moved with purpose. The receptionist, a polished blonde with sharp eyes, barely looked up as she tapped into her computer. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked, her tone dismissive. Elena placed the gold card on the desk. "Leo Romano is expecting me." The receptionist's eyes flickered with recognition. Without another word, she pressed a button. "Take the private elevator to the 72nd floor. Mr. Romano is waiting." Elena stepped inside the elevator, her heartbeat quickening with each floor she passed. By the time the doors opened, she was face to face with an office that screamed power. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city, and the air smelled like expensive leather and faint cigar smoke. And there, standing behind a massive mahogany desk, was Leo Romano. He looked completely at ease, dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than Victor's monthly salary. His piercing blue eyes locked onto hers, amused but unreadable. "Elena." He leaned against his desk, his lips curving into a slow smirk. "Glad you made it." She took a breath. "I almost didn't." Leo chuckled. "But you did. That's what matters." Elena crossed her arms. "What do you want from me?" Leo motioned toward the plush chair across from his desk. "Sit." She hesitated but eventually sank into the seat. Leo studied her for a moment before speaking. "You were married to Victor for how long?" 6 years, she said, her voice tight. "And in those 6 years," Leo continued, "how much of his business did you handle?" Elena frowned. "What?" Leo tilted his head. "You managed his finances. His meetings. His connections. You kept his business running, didn't you?" Elena stiffened. I helped. But Victor made all the final decisions." Leo scoffed. "That's what he wanted people to think." He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his desk. "Tell me, Elena, who actually balanced the books when the numbers didn't add up? Who made sure his investors stayed happy? Who handled the press when he was too busy screwing around?" Her fingers curled into her lap. She had done all of it. Victor had smiled for the cameras, but behind the scenes, it was her who kept his empire from falling apart. Leo saw her realization and smirked. "Victor never saw your worth. But I do." Elena swallowed, her voice softer now. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I don't need a wife, Elena." Leo's gaze darkened. "I need a partner." She frowned. "A partner?" Leo sat back in his chair, exuding effortless control. "Marry me." Elena froze. "What?" she whispered, sure she had misheard. Leo smirked. "Relax. I'm not asking for love. This isn't about romance." She stared at him, still in shock. "Then what is it about?" Leo's expression hardened. "It's about power." Elena's heart pounded as he continued. "Victor built his empire on your back, Elena. He used you and discarded you the moment he thought you weren't useful anymore." Her throat tightened. Leo leaned forward. "What if I told you there's a way to take everything from him? To show him what a mistake he made?" She sucked in a sharp breath. "You marry me," Leo said smoothly, "and I'll give you something Victor never did, real power." Elena felt her world tilt. Marriage? To Victor's worst enemy? It was insane. It was reckless. But as she sat there, remembering the cold way Victor had thrown her out, remembering the nothing he had left her with, it was also tempting. Victor had underestimated her. He had believed she was weak, that she would crumble without him. But he was wrong. She met Leo's gaze, And this time, she wasn't afraid. Her lips parted, and a single word escaped. Deal. Elena never thought she'd be standing at the altar again, least of all beside Leo Romano, Victor's greatest enemy. The wedding was private, no media, no elaborate fanfare, just a sleek legal contract and a signature binding her to the most powerful man in the city. No love, no romance. Just a deal. She wasn't Mrs. Romano out of passion. She was Mrs. Romano out of strategy. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't a wife, she was a weapon. 1 month later, Elena walked into the elite gala with Leo's hand resting lightly on the small of her back. The room buzzed as eyes turned to them, whispers trailing in their wake. She was no longer the discarded wife of Victor Hawthorne. She was Elena Romano, the new power player in town. Victor was there. Of course he was. Dressed in his finest suit, a younger woman clinging to his arm, no doubt his upgrade. But it wasn't her that made Victor's jaw clench. It was Elena. Dressed in a silk emerald gown that hugged her perfectly, her makeup flawless, confidence radiating from her like armor. She met his eyes across the room and smiled. Not the broken, desperate smile of a woman begging to be seen. It was a victorious smile. A silent "you lost." Victor's grip on his glass tightened. Leo smirked beside her. "He's furious," he murmured, his lips barely moving. Elena took a sip of her champagne. "Good." Victor stormed over, leaving his little toy behind. "What is this?" he sneered, eyes flicking between her and Leo. "A joke." Elena tilted her head. "I don't see anything funny." Victor's jaw flexed. "You think you can walk into my world on his arm and—" "This was never your world, Victor," Leo interrupted, his voice low and dangerous. "You just borrowed it." "But Elena and I own the room." Victor scoffed. "She's nothing without me." Elena's smile didn't falter. "Funny. I was thinking the same about you." Victor's eyes darkened, but before he could respond, Leo leaned in, whispering just loud enough for him to hear. "Careful, or you're speaking to Mrs. Romano now." Victor's face burned red. For the first time, he looked at Elena with something that resembled fear. And that was just the beginning. 2 months later, Elena was no longer just a name whispered in scandal. She was a force. Leo taught her everything Victor never had. She studied business, learned negotiation tactics, and took charge of companies Victor once dominated. She stole his top clients, outperformed his strategies, and outshined his name in every social and business circle. She didn't just want to beat Victor. She wanted to erase him. And the final blow was coming. 3 months later, the ultimate business merger. Elena sat at the long conference table, her nails tapping lightly against the polished wood. Across from her sat Victor. Except, this time, he wasn't the arrogant, untouchable businessman he once was. Now, he was a man on the edge. His company was failing. His stocks were crashing. And the only deal that could save him belonged to Elena. She leaned back in her chair, studying him. "You look tired, Victor. Business isn't treating you well?" His jaw clenched. "This merger will benefit us both." Elena smiled. "No. It'll benefit you. I already have everything I need." Victor's nostrils flared. "Elena, let me remind you of something," she interrupted, her voice calm. 3 months ago, you threw me out like trash. But I have everything you want." Victor's hands curled into fists. Leo smirked beside her. "You're lucky my wife is even considering this meeting." Victor's gaze snapped to Leo. "My wife." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Because this wasn't just business anymore. This was personal. Elena stood, placing the contract back in the folder. "I think we're done here." Victor's eyes widened slightly. "Wait." Elena turned to him, arching a brow. Victor exhaled, his pride clearly suffocating him. "What do you want?" And there it was. The moment he realized he lost. She leaned down, her voice dropping to a whisper only he could hear. "You threw me out in the rain, Victor." She smiled. "Did you really think I wouldn't learn how to swim?" Victor didn't answer. He couldn't. Because for the first time in his life, he had been defeated. by the woman he had underestimated the most. Elena walked out of the boardroom, Leo beside her. She didn't need to look back. Victor's downfall was already written. Victor Hawthorne was a man who had always been in control. Until now. The empire he had built, the power he had wielded for years, was slipping through his fingers like sand. His top clients? Gone. His business? Failing. And the woman he had once dismissed as nothing? She was now his biggest nightmare. Elena Romano wasn't just standing at Leo's side. She was leading the charge against him. And Victor knew, deep in his gut, this wasn't just about business. This was about payback. And she was winning. Victor's office, late night. Victor slammed his fist onto his desk, his pulse hammering. His assistant stood frozen in the doorway, eyes wide with fear. "Say that again," Victor growled. The assistant swallowed. "Sir, the investors are pulling out. They don't trust the numbers. Romano Enterprises just secured the international deal you were bidding for." Victor's vision blurred with fury. Elena. They had backed him into a corner. His empire was crumbling. And he had no one to blame but himself. With a sharp breath, he grabbed his coat and stormed out. There was only one person he needed to face. And she was going to listen. Romano Enterprises, Elena's office. Elena was in the middle of reviewing a financial report when the door to her office slammed open. Victor stood in the doorway, his chest heaving, his face contorted in rage. Her assistant rushed in behind him. "Mrs. Romano, I tried to stop him." Elena lifted a hand. "It's fine." The assistant hesitated, but after a nod from Elena, she backed away. Victor stormed forward, slamming his hands on her desk. "You think you've won?" he sneered. Elena tilted her head, calm as ever. "Haven't I?" Victor's jaw clenched. "You think taking my business, my clients, my deals?" "Our clients," she corrected smoothly. "After all, I was the one who built those relationships while you were too busy chasing your better options." Victor's hands balled into fists. "You were nothing without me," he spat. Elena didn't even flinch. Instead, she stood, slowly, deliberately, and walked around her desk until she was face to face with him. Her voice was quiet but lethal. "That's where you're wrong, Victor." She took a step closer. "You were nothing without me." Victor's breathing turned ragged. For the first time, he saw it. She wasn't the fragile woman he had thrown out in the rain. She wasn't the desperate wife who had clung to his approval. She was fire. And she had burned him to the ground. He reached out, gripping her wrist, his fingers pressing hard against her skin. "You don't get to do this to me," he hissed. Before Elena could respond, a smooth, dark voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Touch my wife again," Leo murmured from the doorway, stepping inside, "and you won't have hands to sign your bankruptcy papers." Victor stiffened. Elena felt a slow, dangerous smirk tug at her lips. Leo crossed the room with the kind of confidence that made men fear him. He placed a protective hand on Elena's waist, his presence radiating dominance. Victor's gaze flickered between them. The realization settled in his eyes. He had lost everything. His company. His power. His pride. And the woman he had underestimated? She was standing beside the man who had destroyed him. Victor's hands trembled as he let go of Elena's wrist. He whispered, voice hoarse. "You really hate me that much?" Elena held his gaze, unwavering. "I don't hate you, Victor." She leaned in just enough for her words to sting. "I just finally see you for what you are." Victor swallowed hard. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out. Elena exhaled, her body finally relaxing. Leo brushed his fingers along her arm. "Are you okay?" She looked up at him, a slow, victorious smile spreading across her lips. "Never better." Victor Hawthorne was a ghost now. And Elena Romano? She had won. The city stretched out beneath Elena, glittering with lights as she stood on the balcony of her penthouse. This view was once Victor's. Now it was hers. Her empire. Her throne. And the man who had once thrown her out into the rain? He was nothing but a distant memory. 3 months later, Victor Hawthorne's downfall had been swift. His empire collapsed like a house of cards. His once loyal investors? They had jumped ship. The business world had moved on, replacing his name with hers. The media called it the rise of Elena Romano. The woman Victor had discarded had become the one thing he could never ignore. More powerful than him. Victor was no longer a billionaire. He was a shadow. A man who had been forced to sell his mansion, his cars, everything. And Elena? She thrived. Her name was feared, respected, spoken in boardrooms with reverence. She had everything. And yet, as she stood there, watching the city she now ruled, a voice pulled her from her thoughts. "You're quiet." Elena turned to see Leo, standing beside her, his hands in his pockets. Unlike Victor, Leo didn't see her as a trophy. He saw her as his equal. And somehow, that meant more than she wanted to admit. She smirked. "Just thinking." Leo leaned against the railing. "About what?" She exhaled, looking back at the skyline. For so long, she had been chasing something. Revenge. Power. Justice. And now that she had it, did she feel complete? Leo studied her. "Do you regret it?" Elena let out a soft laugh. Not for a second. Victor had thought she would crumble without him. Instead, she had risen. Stronger. Wiser. Untouchable. She turned to Leo, her lips curling into a slow smile. "Let's build something bigger." Leo's brow lifted, intrigued. Bigger. Elena's eyes gleamed. Victor's world was small. He played it safe. She turned back to the city. "But we could own everything." Leo chuckled, shaking his head. "You're ruthless, Mrs. Romano." She smirked. "And you love it." He didn't deny it. Instead, he reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. This wasn't the ending Victor had written for her. This was a new beginning. She wasn't just someone's wife anymore. She was a queen. And the man who had once thrown her out in the rain? He was nothing but dust beneath her heels. The end. If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep bringing heartwarming stories almost every day. We are very grateful for your support. See you soon.